Okay, I'm Kingsley Purdam from Social Statistics, and this is Rachel Gibson. I work in CCSR, Centre for Census and Social Research. You can find that webpage there, and Rachel works at Institute for Social Change. So, big data. So this is what Hubbard said last week, I think. To me, Twitter is a cardiogram of the passion of the live moment. We say, is it? So Twitter has been used as a medium of protest and as a tool for communicating during natural disasters. But how is Twitter and big data more generally usable for social research? And this was a quote from an academic from recent research I've been involved in. And the concern is about under-theorized empiricism in social science. So uncritical use of data and the limitations of data. So I'm going to talk briefly about some issues around social media data and big data, and then Rachel's going to talk about digitized methods, which is about the translation of more traditional methods or orthodox methods into an online context. And then I'll say a little bit about using social media data for research. So just quickly, I wanted to talk about this idea of it being the age of data. I'm sure all social sciences have said it's the age of data, in particular cohort, but there is a huge volumes of data about preferences, behavior, new types of data from genetics, movement data, transaction data, as well as administrative data. So in the UK, the Freedom Information Act gives people the right to request data, and there has to be a genuine reason for them not to be given that data. That's being used for social research. Social media data, so estimates aren't always that reliable in this area, but 2.5 billion unique social media users, estimates of 500 million tweets per day, 1 billion Facebook accounts. So new data means new opportunities for social science, but new challenges as well. So we have this term big data, and it's been criticized, and it's been tried to define, and there's 3 ways of defining it, and these kind of debates. But as social scientists, I don't think we necessarily need to get into the specific definition, but more look at its potential and some of the challenges. So in 2001, the American information technologists talked about the information explosion. And that big data as a term certainly moves us forward. But we have different data regimes, warehoused internationally, and we have to look at how social researchers might access that data. And there are some claims about N equals all. So if you're a social statistician, you're always interested in the size of the sample. And some people are claiming we're not interested in the sample anymore because we've got so much data. So that's quite high risk. And so you might want to look at things like Google Correlate, where you can immediately correlate a search term. I'll just point out some interesting kind of places to go to try and look at what's happening in the world of social media data and big data. And there are lots of players out there, commercial companies trying to make their claim or build their businesses around the explanatory power of things like social media data, and some are better than others, some are more reliable than others, and some are more expensive than others. So it's a step change for social science, social research, but only in the sense of bringing together different types of data. Okay? So methodologically, there are increasing opportunities for linking data, and this really already exists, so I wanted you to have a sense of context. Okay? So some of the well-established social surveys in the UK have 50 years of data, and they have data that's linked from people within the data set to other forms of administrative data. So you might have one of the cohort studies linked with some benefits data, or one of the cohort studies with people's credit and pension records. So if we were interested in researching antisocial behaviour, we might go to the British Crime Survey, but that data could be used alongside criminal records, reoffender data that the Home Office might attach to your data. We might look at Twitter and blog posts by police officers, as well as the public. We might do some qualitative follow-up. So the range of tools and data out there is increased considerably. So just as an example, I know as social scientists, you're really always keen to see the data. So this is Greater Manchester Police, quick screenshot of their 24-hour Twitter account showing incident calls. So call 215, stolen vehicle heading towards Manchester neighbourhood dispute in Wigan, these kind of things. So lots of variables in there in terms of volume, time, incident levels, these kind of things. So just finally then, there's challenges, more data, less methods. So what I'll come back to after I've handed over to Rachel is looking at the importance of hypothesis testing, data access, computation, and programming skills, issues of bias, and issues about the idea that we now know everything. So there's a debate about, okay, well, if the data isn't there, then we don't need to know it. But there's issues around vulnerable populations, hard to reach groups where we might not know about their circumstances. And so the second half of this talk, as I mentioned, is about digitized methods. And this is about adapting so-called traditional social science to online use.
As Kingsley said, there's maybe a way of describing the difference is that there are digital methods and digitized. And the distinction was drawn by Richard Rogers, who is a computer science scientist working in the Netherlands. And he made the distinction to try and characterize the fact that there are digital methods which are developed for online specific analysis. So would be developed, they're online themselves, they analyze online data. And there are digitized methods which are basically old kind of methods which have been migrated or moved to the online environment. And in a sense, although, as Kingsley's mentioned, everybody's very excited about big data and the possibilities that social media raise for linkage, data linkage, understanding kind of in an unobtrusive way patterns of behavior in society that we previously haven't been able to observe. So there's a whole new range, exciting range of information available to us now. Old methods as well have adapted and can be used to study both the online environment and also the offline environment as well. And so these are just some of the examples of probably the major methods that have moved to the online environment, and just maybe taking a moment to think through what are the implications of that shift. So typically now you can conduct interviews. I don't know if you've done in your research using Skype, so you can actually interview subjects across different countries. It makes interviewing much easier. It gives you a direct transcript as well if you can have software that actually records the interview. You can give people time to sort of answer the questions a little bit more. Similarly, in focus groups as well, there's now companies which specialize and run online focus groups where you can recruit people. They don't all have to be in one location. They can log on. And one of the things about that, I suppose, is that if you want to run a focus group where people don't know what the other people look like, where you're trying to kind of neutralize the setting, that's very helpful. People have form no prejudices about those in the group with them. They're able to answer at their own time. Occasionally in kind of focus groups that are handled face-to-face, you can get one dominant person. Through online focus groups, you can perhaps moderate a bit more easily and get people who are not contributing to contribute to the discussion. So there's certain advantages that come with the kind of digitized method, certain disadvantages as well, but certain advantages that you can point to that the online environment gives you in terms of gathering data that we previously used just through face-to-face or telephone methods. Surveys are a commonly used online digitized method. I mean, they offer obvious advantages in terms of cost. Surveys are increasingly expensive and response rates are going down. An online survey is not cost-free, but it is much less costly than running a random probability sample where you have to go out and talk to people face-to-face. Of course, there are a lot of disadvantages with online surveys. So probably, I think it's about 80% now, or I may be wrong, but it's about 80% population in the UK at least report access or some kind of use of the internet. Amongst those people, some are more or less skilled. Some would not like to complete a survey online. Some people just can't. So if you're trying to generalize to the broader population using an online survey, you're in trouble because you can only get those people who use the internet, and it's still not the whole population. So you have to be careful about any kind of generalization that you draw regarding your results. So that's just some of the kind of sort of pros and cons, perhaps, about thinking about online surveys. There's also now there's an understanding of online. You can get various communities forming, what we say virtual communities around particular topics, around health. Local communities can have a presence online. And the net actually offers you a way to study those communities in a similar way to as people did in ethnography, which is when people would actually go and observe physically a space and a community and learn about that community through participant observation. Now you can do that through what's called netnography, and that's becoming a kind of more recognized methodology to study what is seen as these virtual communities. Another area that's kind of migrated online as well is content analysis. And in a sense, this is a slight hybrid in that websites and social media formats didn't exist before the internet, obviously. So we've kind of had to adapt some of the content analysis tools that people used to use primarily for textual data. So content analysis, when one has used things like NVivo or other kinds of software, has approached it from the basis of a text and tried to understand it through textual analysis. Obviously, websites combine text with audio, with pictures, and social media. I mean, now we see tweets, we see blog posts that have shortened kind of words. It's almost a new vocabulary. So it creates, again, another sort of challenge for social scientists to think about how do we then try and code what we see through some kind of content analysis. So I just want to talk through a couple of projects that have tried to do this, this latter kind of idea of looking at websites in particular and also social media from a kind of content analysis or more traditional sort of perspective. So this was a project that I ran with, where are you, Marta, over in the corner? So Marta Kantiok and I in ISC, we ran a project comparing online democracy and elections. And it was looking at 4 countries, the UK, the US, Australia, and France. And it did a number of things, and probably, I think it started in 2010, and it used a lot of old methodologies. If we were running this now, I think we'd have to update ourselves and use a lot more sort of digital methods, but we tended to rely on digitized. And what we did was we looked at websites and social media sites of candidates and parties in series of elections in these 4 countries across a 2-year time period. And what we're interested in was the extent to which the candidates, the parties, were using social media to try and interact and engage with voters and the public. Was it making campaigning a more interactive and kind of participatory experience? So what we did was just gives you some ideas. So our central question was, was it democratizing and kind of deprofessionalizing the process, meaning that it was letting more grassroots input into campaigning, giving citizens kind of the ability to do more things online and take more kind of an active role in the campaign rather than just simply receive information and then go out and vote. So what we did was we had a number of different levels to it. And one was we looked at the parties and the candidates themselves. We did some interviews with them, mostly face-to-face rather than through Skype, but some were through Skype. And we captured their web presence. So we used an archiving site called Archive It, which is a professional service based in the US that does work for academics that are kind of, it has a sort of academic rate, a subsidized rate. So we asked them to archive key websites from the elections, these 4 elections from 2010 to 2012. And then we applied a series of coding schemes to the content. So we looked first at the website. So this was be an example. So this is Labour's website from 2010. This is typically what you'll see. Party sites, they have some kind of emphasis on what their policies are, who their people are, so biographies, ways that you can get involved. You can follow this, the party through Facebook, so they have links to their social media profiles. And a news and kind of update sort of information page. So what we did was first we just looked at the kind of Web 1 aspects, or the sort of more static kind of obvious forms, and we just gave, we developed indices that looked at, well, how much information did they provide and what type of information? Was it basic information, just a listing of the local branches, how you could contact them? Was there information about the election in particular? Did they try and generate resources? So did they offer people the opportunity to donate money? Did they offer opportunity to join the party? And what kinds of opportunities did they offer for feedback and interaction? So did they allow people to take a poll, submit a contact form, join a chat room? And I think, if we're lucky, you can see that this was the result. This is just some of the statistics that we got looking at the 6 parties. So what you can do is, what we did was we converted it into kind of quantitative sort of data to be able to compare the parties in terms of what they were doing and how active they were in promoting feedback and interaction. Versus providing information, and we could compare the parties. You can see in a way there's not a huge amount of variance. The parties are all quite similar in terms of their web content provision, and that kind of reflects a sort of standardization in a way of political parties, that they're all figuring out what they want to provide on social media during, or the web during elections, and they sort of follow a kind of a template in a way. Probably the most difference came in the feedback and the interaction, which you can see the Liberals, Lib Dems and BNP were actually the highest in terms of offering opportunities for participation. The bigger parties were less open to that, which sort of conforms a little bit in a way to what we'd expect, because the bigger parties are all about winning votes and don't have the time so much to sort of have chats with voters and tend to sort of prioritise strategic aims over that kind of participatory aspect. That if we then continue on, I'll carry on because of time. So we also looked at their social media profile. So this is the Facebook page of the Liberal Democrats. I think it was after the first debate. And you can see people posting. So what we did was we went in and we said, okay, various different dimensions of their social media presence. There's YouTube, there's Facebook, there's Twitter, and there are blogs. So we then tried to come up with a kind of way of sort of capturing those data. I don't know if you can see, you can't see. So this actually shows you some of the coding that we used. So what we were interested in was, had they an old or new Facebook profile? So this would tell us a little bit about when the Facebook profile had been launched. Sort of, were they part of the initial wave to get online with Facebook, or had they joined kind of subsequently, sort of joined the bandwagon? Did they have owner allowing so the owner posted on the wall? And then what we were interested in was, did they allow other people to post and comment as well? So how diverse was their posting? Did they allow for feedback? Did they respond to that feedback? And did they moderate it? And so we were just trying to get a sense of perhaps how active they were and how responsive they were. And we did this for, again, each of the political parties and their leaders. And we also, just some very basic metrics that you can calculate for parties and candidates. It's about their followers, so that's very easy to find out. You can just monitor that through the course of the campaign. And as I said, we looked here, this is comparing the Facebook profiles of Conservative, Labour and the Green Party, just comparing one day before the election, how many times they'd posted, how many comments they'd received, and the average number of comments per post. And you can see that actually the Green Party were really quite inactive, which is quite surprising, but the Conservative and Labour Party were reasonably active, and they were getting quite a lot of comments. Still nothing compared to something like Obama in the US, which the British stats were completely dwarfed and sort of dominated by the US. I think Obama had 33 million followers on Facebook in the last election, so our party's got a way to go. This is just another case study. So Rosalind couldn't be here today, but Rosalind is a PhD student of myself and Kingsley, and she did a really nice analysis of the general election in 2010, looking at a similar type of question, but she looked in a lot more detail. She looked by constituency, basically. She didn't just look at the national parties, but she looked in each constituency to see whether or not one of the 6 parties that I just mentioned had a presence on the web, what kind of presence they have. Did they just have a website? Did they have a YouTube presence? Different kinds of Web 2 use, and she also measured email responses. So she sent a sample of the overall number of candidates that she had. She tested their responsiveness in terms of email, and she asked, a series of questions about policy to see if they would respond to her, and some of the results are quite interesting. So what she did for Web 2 use, so this is just to show you another way that you might go about gathering a particular population's use of Web 2. So she looked at Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and blogs. And as I said, she took, of her overall number of constituents, she took the most marginal, 177. And then she focused in on the candidates that were competing from those 6 parties mentioned earlier. So she had a total of 751 candidates or parties that she was looking at. And what she did was she divided Web 2 use into a series of categories, which is quite nice. So she had static, which was basically that they used the web, they used the YouTube, they used Facebook, but they just posted on it, really nothing else. If it was, then she had an active category, which was slightly more, and then open, and then interactive. And her measurement of this was, so static was, as I said, this is what kind of one-way use of the applications. So the candidate used the technology, but never updated it, and it was pretty much like a leaflet being put through your door in terms of getting the campaign message across. Active was where it was one way, and the candidate is updating the content, actively updating the content. But she was arguing that this is kind of not that much greater of an improvement on Web 1 activity, and it's just simply that they're monitoring it and keeping hold of it and watching what's happening. Open was where they actually did have some kind of two-way interaction. So they would get comments, but they very little evidence that actually they were necessarily responding to them. And the interactive was the highest level of effective use, where they were opening up for comment, but they were also actually showing evidence that they were listening and responding. So this is just another way that you might think about perhaps categorizing or coming up with some kind of scaling or understanding of how actors, political, social actors, are using the technology. Her email study was very interesting and probably one of the first ones that I've seen done, actually. I haven't seen any others that have been done to this extent. So she had a design where which was a constituent. She sent them an email where she basically asked them a question, where she didn't make it clear whether or not she was living in their constituency or not, but they could interpret it that way if they wanted to. And she asked them a question about a policy on students and education. And then she waited to see whether or not they responded. So she actually didn't, I think only about half of those sent the email actually responded, so a lot of them did not. So that was the first interesting point. And then she analysed the actual text to say, well, you know, what was the nature of the response? And so what you could do if you wanted to do this was basically come up with just binary of did they respond, did they not respond, how long did it take for them to respond, and then she coded them just in terms of the candidate characteristics so she could understand, well, who was responding and how fast were they responding. And then she looked at the content, and so she divided up and she said, well, okay, did they actually use my name? Was it personalized response? Did they give me just kind of generalized kind of election content? Did they try to send related content to my query? And was it specifically related to my query? So you can see that there were levels to which you could get higher marks, if you like, as a candidate if you had been able to develop a more personalized response. And she's, I think, finished analysing the data from that and produced a paper out of it. So I'll give her a little plug if you want to contact her about that. So that's just to say there's different ways of using kind of older methods, if you like, to kind of adapt to the new online environment.
So just going back to the idea of big data, social media data, and how we might use it for social research. So there's huge volumes of data out there, as I've mentioned, about decisions, preferences. But why is this important? And just to refer back to a bit of my own research, I'm very interested in mass observation movement from the early 20th century in the UK. And this is where volunteers recorded the life around them and submitted them centrally. Mass Observation Archive is still going at the University of Sussex, and you can look at daily records, and the people are still recording daily life. And some of the archive data on the Mass Observation Archive from the early 20th century is very similar to that posted on Twitter and blogs today. And they were the untold stories in many ways. It was politically driven in the sense that there were unreported stories of poverty, inequality, and poor health. But it was accused, just as social media data is, of bias and questions about generalizability. So I'll just show you some examples. So this is how the Mass Observation Archive went about doing a survey. They put posters up and asked people to report in how happy they were. Or they might have collected diary records. People have kept a diary and submitted them. So this one says, as I left the job I had a fortnight ago, I was not working Saturday, so under the circumstances, the day was normal. So that reminds me of a tweet. Do you know what I mean? Perhaps a bit more interesting than some tweets. But I rose at 7:30. So there's a kind of a relationship here about this data that's being generated through social media. And so what would a modern equivalent be? I don't know if you've seen the Satellite Sentinel project, which is based on satellite observation of Sudan, and people code evidence of military activity in Sudan. So there's hundreds of thousands of satellite images, and volunteers code whether there's been some military operations. They're trying to monitor what the government is doing in Sudan. So that's kind of like a charity organisation, but it's a similar kind of mass observation. Now, there are lots of ethics around mass observation and people accused of being spies and these kind of things and the ideology behind it. But tweeting is quite similar in terms of evidence about recording your daily lives. So people's lives, if we go back to the present, are increasingly online, accessing services, communicating, information gathering. But how can we use this data for social research? So there are lots of tools out there. Discover Text, Webometrics, Center Strength, Excel, Node XL, Twitter. There's the Wayback Machine, which I think Rachel referred to. And some are free, but some require free, including Twitter, of course. So the data is generated by citizens, but it's got a commercial value. So just to go through some examples, this is Discover Text. So you can get a 30-day free trial of this. It's quite useful. And you can start collating people's tweets or start collating some Facebook network data. It's good practice if you want to learn about the tool. This is Scraper Wiki. So I did this morning and looked at tweets about government reshuffle. So there's things like no mention of Minister for Disabled, or interesting that Mr. Pickles seems to change so many of his team so often. Now, if you're not from the UK, that sounds a bit obscure, but he's the local government minister. So there's kind of comments about current issues in politics, but how can we use these data? Here's Senti Strength. This is another free tool. So this codes for meaning and emotion in written text. Okay, so it gives it a value of the sentiment in a particular text. This is Node XL, and this is more used with network data, Facebook data, and you can look at relationships or Facebook postings within a particular area or between particular groups. So all those tools can be useful, but what kind of research questions might we have with all this data? So let's explore some of these examples. Some of these relate to my work or people whose work I've looked at. So this is civil unrest in the UK. You might have seen this. It was called Reading the Riots. So this was the collation and coding of Twitter postings during the civil disturbances in the UK a couple of years ago. 2.6 million tweets. And this required skills in social science that brought in computational social scientists, computer programmers, to allow access and allow some kind of explanatory research to be done on the data. So the data was coded in quite a traditional way, in the sense that meaning was tried to be coded from textual data, and some of it was automated and some of it was done by hand as a way of checking. Okay, so they coded the tweets, and it looked at active users. Some of the coding was automated. It's interesting that the automated coding was found to be as accurate as the human coding, okay, because of human error in coding text. But with such large data volumes, 2.6 million tweets, imagine if you had 2.6 million interviews. Yeah? It would be a long PhD. Coding has to be automated. And this is one of the rumours that spread. Frida Viz talks a lot about this. This is the kind of animals escaped from London Zoo. And I show this because I'm not sure of the research question that drove Reading the Riots, okay, as a social scientist. There was lots of data, but a lot of the write-up is about rumour spreading. But I'm not sure that was initially their research question. This turned out to be a fake photo that was retweeted and eventually discovered to be not true. So such studies can be conducted really rapidly. And that is one of the challenges. Suddenly you've got all this data and you're ready to write it up. You might not have been through any ethical process. You might not have been through any peer review. So what is it about? Is it just noise? Is it really about this study in particular? Was it about communication? Was it a study of mobilization? And I've spoke to the researchers involved, and Farida talks about this enormous sense of hatred in relation to looters that came in through some tweets. We've no idea of the scale of that hatred. Who was it? It's just a sample of tweets that showed up. There was also some biases because it was from a sample of tweets. Okay? Twitter is very protective. It won't give you the full volume of tweets at any one time. Yeah? And it's notable that alongside the use of tweets, they relied on traditional methods. So this is the write-up in The Guardian. There was a partnership between University and The Guardian, but this relies on an ICM random sample poll, okay, to look at the causes of the riots. Here's some data from the British Crime Survey, which is a statistically representative large-scale government survey, So once you try and tell the whole story, you need some other data sources. Another example, so attitudes towards the Syrian civil war. So we might have survey data, we might have on-the-ground analysis. So this map is coded from on-the-ground field workers, and it is looking at the strengths of different groups. But we might also use Twitter. Okay? So this is one day's tweets that included the word Assad. Okay? Now, I haven't got really a huge amount of time to code it, but it's 24 hours of tweets. Now, the green line is whether there was any sentiment, okay, in the tweets. Yeah? So we've got an idea, okay, of what's going on. The other lines are whether they were strongly negative, were very weak sentiment or strong sentiment at different points in time. It's not clear, even by the researchers, Michael Thirlwall, if it was from the full Twitter postings at the time or from a sample, because Twitter don't always tell you that. But it's worth looking at that. There's a lot of noise, but there's also some patterns in there, okay, which we can map on to other research. So let's look at flu trends. This is a well-known one. It's not social science, but Google flu trends claims to provide near real-time estimates of flu activity for a number of countries, uses IP addresses. And so this is a map from yesterday. So this is intensity of flu activity, and this is coded from people's searches. Okay? Now, is that a good source? It's not social science, but it shows us a way of doing social science. So this is some calibration tests of the Google flu trends data against some actual virus level data, people who've been diagnosed as having flu, and people who've presented with flu-like illnesses, drop-in centres, but weren't diagnosed. And so this is a calibration test, tweets. Really useful. And there's a strong correlation between the Google searches and the actual levels of diagnosed flu. Okay? So Twitter, in that sense, is proving to be particularly robust. What about sexism and unfair treatment? So this is another area of my research. So I might use a British social attitude survey. I might use a British crime survey and look at experiences of unfair treatment. I might use administrative records, okay, prosecutions. There might be other surveys, ad hoc surveys. I might do a freedom of information request. So you might know that very common one that the BBC did about the rise in domestic violence between men and women during football matches. That came from a freedom of information request. But I might also use blogs and Twitter evidence. So this is, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called the Everyday Sexism Project. It's generated a lot of media interest, and people just submit an experience of sexual harassment they've experienced. So within a short period of time, there were 20,000 reports of sexual harassment. And here's an example. So that data, without the technology, without social media, would not exist. Okay. So that's one particular quote on that. And we might code that for gender, type of incident, whether the person's put repeated posts, these kind of things. Now, there are limitations to that, of course, because although we now know that the reported incidences of sexual harassment are non-zero, people are reporting them, we've no really measure of prevalence. Okay? But you could develop the research design further. You could follow up people who've posted. You could follow their blogs. It's basically useful to inform other data sources. It's not necessarily hugely useful or robust on its own for social science research. So just to quickly look at one more example, this is an area of my research on food insecurity. So we could, again, use government surveys, the cohort studies, which I mentioned before. We could do interviews and focus groups. We could look at food bank use, charities providing crisis funding. But we could look at blog posts again. So this is from the online network Mumsnet, okay, which has, it's an opted-in sample, so there's some biases in there. Okay, so there's a socioeconomic profile to Mumsnet users, but there's also blogs where people put what we would see as qualitative data. Okay, so this one example says I have to cook on a very tight budget, so when I go shopping, I go straight to the reduced selection and always stock up on as much reduced food as possible, etc., etc. So we might code these. Okay, it might frame one of our studies or some interviews or case studies that we're doing. Okay, we might do some follow-up research. Just finally, so voting intentions. Say we're interested in voting, and I know we've talked about it earlier in the day. We might use the British Election Study, which is a survey of voting, a robust survey, which is hosted at Manchester from this year. We might look at British Social Attitudes Survey, or we might use the opinion polls. So this is 5 or 6 opinion polls tracking party support since the election. You can see that Labour are in the lead. We could look at electoral registers, administrative records of whether people voted, whether you went to the polling station. But we could also use Twitter. Okay, so we might look for tweets about going to vote, changing vote, I will not vote for David Cameron, or fill in the blank. And so here's some tweets where that might be coded in that way. Okay, if you've got 2 million of those tweets that you've collected because you've searched using one of the software tools, then you've got some data which you can start to make some claims about. Now it's interesting, this is a study of German elections, and even without coding the meaning of some of the tweets, this was shown to be as accurate as the opinion polls and within 1 or 2% of the actual election result. And this is just mentions of the party, okay, as accurate as an opinion poll. In fact, even, and there's a link here to traditional methods, and I think Rachel and I are keen to get this across. Even mentions of political party in newspaper, the number of times it's been mentioned, has been shown to be as accurate as an opinion poll. So there's a huge power if the data is handled ethically and robustly to explain social change. So voting and intention attitudes. So during the party conferences, we collated the tweets according to certain search terms. And I wanted to show you this because it highlights some of the data issues. So obviously, we picked up Brad Pitt and Cameron Diaz when we were searching for David Cameron. That was a much more interesting tweet. But anyway, there's a different range of attitudes here. So the Land of Hope is Tory, or this tweet about single mothers, can David Cameron do about that? So say we've got 10,000 of those kind of tweets we've collated, then we clean them up, we take out Cameron Diaz. And then we might start to code the individual Twitter account for, say, gender, or look at their other tweets. Okay, look at how many tweets they've done, who they're followed by, these kind of things. And we might use online tools to do that coding for us. So there's a market in social science online, just as there is for health, for people volunteering to be in studies. And so it's called, one of them is called Mechanical Turk, where you contract out the data coding, these large data coding challenges. So are social scientists going to use social media data for social science research? Well, I think they are, and so we need those skills. Evidence at the moment from our survey, which we did last year, says there's kind of quite a strong sense of that it would be potentially useful, things like Twitter and blog data. But there's a fair few people think it's not going to be useful. Now, one of the issues, and I'll come to that just before we finish, is are alternative voices going to be heard then? If you're not using this big data source, potential data source, how will your research take place? How will it be heard amongst all the other claims being made about the data? So these are some of the comments from academics, just to give you some thoughts for yourself. So there is more data for social research, but can people use it and under what conditions? So there's a sense of, for example, with Twitter data, can I link people's posts? Can I look at their identity and look at their comments? So they've published something, but what are the ethics around linking that data? There's comments about data quality. There's this idea of data overload. But there's also some strong messages, and this are just some quotes about how social scientists need to be at the forefront of setting the ethics and the frameworks for analysing these new types of data. So some challenges and good practice. So there are opportunities for more exploratory, inductive and data-driven research, but our view is that it always needs to be hypothesis-driven, okay? And I think in the 2007 it was postulated that we're looking at the end of theory. Now I think the person who said that has backtracked a little bit, but our view is more than ever it should be about testing theories. Just like in Sarah's talk on experimental design, you're testing an intervention. Okay, you're testing something. You're not just swimming in data and finding a pattern. And then, of course, the existing social research good practice about ethics, quality assurance, peer review need to be in place. Now, there are challenges about speeding the processes of peer review up to help kind of the use of this data. So some of the risks, social media data can be partial. Vulnerable and hard to reach groups might not be captured, so you're still going to need bespoke methods. What if policymakers and researchers just relied on Twitter? What kind of world would that be? It's quite common in the media already in terms of news items might say, and we're trying to capture this actually, and that seems to be supported by the tweets we've been getting. Okay, so that's equivalent to saying, a minister saying, and this is really damaging for a social scientist when a minister says, well, only the other day the taxi driver said this. That's as damaging, in my view, in terms of relying on anecdote rather than something that's robust. One of the issues with social media data is demographic information can be missing, but there are tools, as I said, like coding Twitter account holders, gender, these kind of things, or using location software. Data standards are limited for social media data, and then issues of sampling, time of collection, assessments of whether someone's performing in their tweet or whether it's a fake account, really important. And we need to take account of the fact that some research using social media is going to be based on non-probability sample. Sorry, last slide. So the opportunities are there's lots of new skills social scientists can use to explore this data. And we can translate some of the skills we've already got to looking at this kind of data. But some of them will be new. So does anyone know how to make a freedom of information request? Do people know how to use Twitter Firehose? These kind of things as part of your studies. You may be very skilled in modeling data or doing interviews with hard-to-reach groups, these kind of things. So there's a view that social science is moving away from data sets to data streams or data arrays. Okay? So alongside your study, say, of worklessness in Manchester amongst elder men, you need some data on social survey data on the patterns of unemployment. You might look at routes into employment, how people communicate their health issues during worklessness. So you might have some health measures as well. So it's more about data arrays rather than just a single data set. Just finally, I wanted to point this about competing narratives. So if you're not going to use the data, someone else will. Okay. So a recent report in the press was talking about the fact that Tesco know the likelihood of you splitting up from your partner in the next 6 months, just from your purchasing behavior or your online activity. So that kind of trumps a lot of research methods. Okay? But it might not be very good, but they might make the claim. But if we're doing research on relationships, marital breakdown, the impact on families, what affects domestic life, or even going back to sexual harassment, then we need much more information than those simple single stories. So a possible way forward is to think not about replacing the data we've already got, but in terms of the added value of social media data and big data. And we can use different data to cross-validate other types of data. And I've collated some reading there. So there's lots of reading if you want to follow up. And we've put our Twitter account. If you'd like to follow us there, we'll do some analysis. Okay, thanks.